Yeah, so unfortunately that's where the Metallica ends and where I begin. And so first of all, it's a really great honor to be here telling you about what I'm really excited that I get to do for my living. I tell people that I'm so excited that I have a job that basically pays me to get to sit there and think about things that I would think about every day anyway. And so today we're going to follow where Europa is taking me and taking my colleagues in the audience, and talk about the possibility that Europa could right now, today, support life, and what we're learning about that by studying places here on the Earth in order to understand that. And so these are some thanks to the people that I work with that have been really great in helping me put this talk together and teaching me things that I wouldn't know otherwise. So just an introduction to the system that we're talking about. Jupiter is right here in the solar system, so this is to scale. Jupiter really takes over the solar system. It's the largest object by far by mass, and so if you actually broke down the solar system, 99.5% or so would be in the sun of the mass in the whole solar system, and close to the rest of it would be in Jupiter. And so Jupiter's got this really interesting environment, but it also has a set of incredibly interesting moons. So most of what we'll show here is images and information that we learned from the Galileo spacecraft, which was a spacecraft that was flying in the Jupiter system in the late 90s and early 2000s, and sent us back beautiful pictures like these I'm showing here of Jupiter, Io, its interior volcanic moon, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. But the history of the Jovian system began much before that, in fact with Galileo himself, who saw a view of the Jovian system much like the one I'm showing here. So if you were actually to go outside, unfortunately Jupiter's not up right now, but when Jupiter actually is up in the sky and took a pair of really good binoculars, what you'd see is Jupiter, a really bright point of light, and 4 tiny little dots dancing around it. If you watch it over the course of one night, you can actually see the system change, because those moons actually move very rapidly around Jupiter. So just in your backyard, you could do the same experiment that Galileo did hundreds of years ago. And basically what he did was to observe this system, and it taught us that in fact the sun was at the center of our solar system and that the Earth was out at a different position, by observing a system much like that, where Jupiter was at the middle and the moons were going around it. So fast forward a little bit to the time of Galileo the spacecraft, and we get these amazing images of the environment that Europa lives in. So these are Europa's brothers and sisters. This is Io. Io is the most volcanic place in the whole solar system, including the Earth. It's right in close to Jupiter, and what you're seeing right there, let me grab a pointer, that little lit up kind of blue thing up here at the top is actually a giant volcanic plume that's being shot out into space because this moon is so incredibly active. So it's about the size of our own Earth's moon, and so that's a pretty huge volcano that you can actually see from space. Just interior to that is the star of our show tonight. This is Europa. Europa is the 6th largest moon in the solar system, also about the same size as the Earth's moon. But it's totally different from its brother Io. To the interior, Europa has this icy outer shell, a crisscrossed surface covered in fractures and dark brown material that we'll talk about, that's telling us really that it's a really interesting, different place from anywhere else in the solar system in some ways, and also very similar to others in other ways. Just outside of that is Ganymede, and Ganymede's a pretty incredible place as well. In fact, if Ganymede wasn't orbiting Jupiter, it would be considered a planet itself. It's actually bigger than the planet Mercury. But Ganymede also is made mostly of ice, so actually even more ice than on Europa. And so this is a giant icy ocean moon, has its own ocean as well. What's amazing about Ganymede is that it actually has its own magnetic field as well. So it's the only moon in the solar system that has its own magnetic field. And so just outside of that, we have Callisto, which is much different from the moons in the interior. Those first 3 moons play an interesting role. They kind of dance together in orbit around Jupiter. Callisto doesn't exactly participate in that. So it's very, very different, has a very old surface, and hasn't actually completely melted through. Really interesting place, but very different from those moons to the interior. So as we focus in on Europa, what we're going to talk about is the search for energy and life's ingredients, and what we've learned about those in terms of what's up here on the surface and what might be down below. One of the most important interactions that informs that is going to turn out to be its magnetic field. But the reason that we're interested in energy on Europa is that it works a little bit differently than from the Earth. The Earth is in really close to the Sun. We get a lot of energy from interactions with the Sun. That's why biology on Earth is photosynthetic. In here, we have an example of what the Earth looks like in the interior. It has that metal core and a liquid outer core, and then a mantle of material that's overturning as well, and then a kind of, well, mostly global ocean up on the surface. And then if we look at Europa, it's a little bit different. So Europa, we have this rocky interior as well. It also has an iron core. We're not certain yet if it has a liquid layer in that iron core or not. That's one of the things we'd love to find out. But it also has a global ocean. The difference is that the ocean here is being covered up by a global ice layer. And so in this system, we've got a little bit of a different environment than the Earth, but a lot of things in common, especially this ocean. So it turns out that what ends up affecting Europa and giving Europa energy is what that delicate dance between Ganymede, Europa, and Io is actually doing. And so as those three moons are orbiting Jupiter, every once in a while they line up. It's called a resonance, an orbital resonance. And when they line up, they pull each other out of order just a little bit. So what that does is it keeps Europa's orbit from becoming perfectly circular. Because Jupiter's so massive, it wants Europa to actually stay in a circular orbit. But the other moons just pull it out of line just ever so slightly. That allows this, instead of being a perfect circle, to be just a little bit of an ellipse. And what happens is that as the moon gets in just a little bit closer to Jupiter, it gets kind of pulled and stretched out. And when it moves farther away, it gets recompressed. And so it gets a lot of energy. It turns out that this energy from orbits, from gravity itself, is what's powering those volcanoes on Io. So whereas the Earth is powered by the Sun and by energy from its own interior because it's so massive, Io, Europa, and Ganymede are powered by this orbital interaction that they have around Jupiter. And so it works a little bit like this. Basically, as it's going around, it gets stretched out and then compressed back in. If you've ever taken a rubber band and you've pulled it out and put your fingers on it, if you pull that rubber band as you put your fingers on it, you can actually feel the rubber band heat up a little bit. That's exactly what's happening to Europa as it's orbiting Jupiter. It's getting stretched out just a little bit, and it's heating up its interior. So what we're trying to understand is what is the consequence of that? What happens when a whole planet is warmed up from an interaction like that? Well, at Io, we know it's powering huge volcanoes. At Europa, we know we have a global ocean, and we have an ice shell on top. But what might be going on down here at the base? Something else that's really interesting about the system is that Jupiter has a huge magnetic field. So the Earth has a magnetic field that plays an important role in how we live here on Earth, protects us from radiation from space. And so Jupiter also has that. But in Jupiter's case, the magnetic field is so huge that it's actually constantly bombarding the surface. So it's sending in highly energized particles that end up bathing down on the surface of Europa and knocking off electrons and changing the materials on the surface. So actually, not a very nice place to stand if you're actually alive here. But the surface, it turns out, is being changed by those materials, or by those interactions with Jupiter's magnetic field. And another thing that's important about this interaction is that it actually is why we know there's an ocean on Europa. Turns out that magnetic fields can tell us what the deep interior of a planet is. And as Europa orbits around, its magnetic field changes depending on the magnetic field it's getting from Jupiter. And that actually tells us that there's a conductor down there. And a conductor could be anything that can carry a flow of electrons. So iron does a really good job, but another thing that does a really good job is salty seawater. And so that's actually how we know that there's an ocean down there. So the magnetic field turns out to be kind of a rock star at Europa. And why we care about all of this is because we're interested in energy, because that is in fact what life is doing. At its most basic level, life is like a battery. It's essentially just passing electrons from one place to one place. Simple chemistry is just the flow of electrons. And life at its most general is just the same thing. It's passing electrons around in an organized manner. it turns out that here on Earth, a really important part of that is its interplay with geology. So as we talk about energy in environmental systems, particularly here on the Earth, things like the rock cycle end up refreshing that biosphere. They change the chemistry, and they allow for interactions between water and rock, for weathering reactions in the atmosphere. And it also turns out that here on Earth, biology kind of couples into these processes as well. And so it's possible that, in fact, in order to have life arise anywhere, you might need cycles like this, an actively recycling process, so that you can couple that flow of energy. So much like life itself, geologic systems are also like batteries. And so here's an example of a system that we probably have all heard a lot about. This is an image of what's happening at a seafloor vent. So in the deep ocean of the Earth, you get basically spreading axis. So the plates of the Earth are pulling apart, hot magma is coming up, and you're heating the seawater. And it turns out that the interaction of that heated seawater with the water around it can actually produce some of these systems that act a little bit like chemistry and life that we're so interested in. That's why we think about these systems in terms of maybe a really good place for the origins of life is because of the chemistry of this system and the energy flow all the way around. And so basically you're passing electrons from this reduced material, from electron donors that come through from water-rock reactions into a system up here. And so it turns out that when we think about living on Earth, we think about breathing oxygen, and that's where we're getting basically our oxidants. That's where the word comes from. But in the ocean, you can do it without the presence, at least, of an atmosphere. And so when we're trying to think about Europa, we're thinking about it in these terms, in terms of how do we get electron acceptors and electron donors, and what chemical systems might set up, especially if that interior is active. These are really interesting because we can actually study them in the laboratory. And this is actually a black smoker grown in Europa-like conditions in a laboratory at the Jet Propulsion Lab by a friend of mine, Lori Barge. And so what they actually do is they set up an ocean-like chemistry, they heat it up at the bottom, and they change the iron concentration and allow these kind of chimney structures to grow. And so then what they can do is study them at their very closest levels to look at the structures that help mediate that chemistry. So what is happening here is really just a system that sets up an electron flow. There's a change in pH from out here, or to inside. And so what that actually does is it kind of mimics what life is doing. It passes electrons around. It sets up a chemical system that reminds us of things that life does. And so that's why we're so interested, at one level, in the possibility for vents at seafloors. And so I had a video of one of these things growing just in really fast order. So this is kind of like a Europa ocean chemistry, and you just drop a little bit of iron and you actually grow these structures. And it turns out the shape of these structures in this test tube depends on the concentration of materials in the fluid. And so as you change this, you get more of these little pipes here and less of these bulb-like structures. And so all of these things change with chemistry. And so it's a really interesting environment, and why chemistry, thinking about that in an environment, is so important. So back to Europa. Why are we interested in Europa? Well, we know it has energy from tides that might be heating up that seafloor. But in the solar system, why are we so interested? Well, I like to think about it in terms of energy and water, which are two things we know that we need for life here on Earth. And if you think about looking at planets on this scale, Europa reminds me quite a lot of the Earth. It's got that rocky interior, and it's got an ocean layer, and the same thing here on Europa. Mars probably did, or very possibly did, really early on, but right now doesn't seem to have an ocean up on the surface. So it's very possible that life arose here on Mars at one point in time. The reason I'm interested in Europa, and the reason many people are interested in Europa, is because that ocean is still there. That energy source is still there. So while it looks kind of strange and it's a little bit far away, it turns out to be maybe just as exciting, or even more so, in terms of life right now. In terms of even in its own system, we ask the question, where's the ocean? So in the Galilean system, we've got Europa here with the ocean in contact with the rock down below. And if we look at the other moons, Ganymede and Callisto, it turns out that their oceans are in a very different place. So on Earth, we think maybe life originates at seafloor vents where water and rock is interacting. Well, on Ganymede and on Callisto, that opportunity doesn't exist. Here you have an ocean that's actually perched above different types of ice. Ganymede is so huge that it actually highly pressurizes the material, so you get a different phase of ice. And that ice keeps the ocean from interacting with the rocky core. So Europa's got water and rock reacting, Ganymede doesn't really. Not only does Ganymede not, but also Callisto doesn't. And Callisto, you see, there's something missing here. It hasn't really finished differentiating. It actually never melted all the way through. And so we've got maybe a very different system here on Europa, a more Earth-like system. And in terms of other moons in the solar system, you've probably heard a lot about Titan. Right? Cassini is out at Titan right now, exploring Titan, telling us a lot about its environment. One of the differences, though, is that Titan is almost as big as Ganymede. And so in Titan, we actually think that it's the same situation, where you've got a high-pressure ice that's keeping that water from interacting with the rock below. So it's a little bit different than this system and a little bit more unlike our Earth. You may also have heard about Enceladus. Enceladus is this really exciting place because it's got huge, huge geysers coming out of the South Pole. Really amazing little moon, but it turns out that that's the part that's important. It's really, really little. So if you look at, this is about the size of the Earth's moon, this is about the size of the planet Mercury, and there's little Enceladus. Enceladus, if it happened to be in the asteroid belt, would only be the 4th largest asteroid. So it's really a little tiny place, still very exciting. This is what Enceladus looks like. But also, it looks like Enceladus just has a little pocket of water. So we've got a whole ocean here in contact with rock, an ocean but maybe not in contact with rock, and maybe not an ocean at all. So that is why kind of all signs point in direction of Europa, is that it's got that maybe very Earth-like familiarity to it, where you've got this potential for active seafloor vents, an oxidized environment up here. And if this process is actually recycling, we might be creating things like this even to this day on Europa. So we're pretty excited about this kind of ocean moon. Another reason that we're excited about Europa is because we know of places here on Earth and of organisms here on Earth that would be happy in certain environments on Europa. If we could take them there, they might be very happy. So examples of those are thermophiles. Thermophiles means heat-loving. They really like hot places. Thermophiles are the types of microorganisms that we find in seafloor vents, that we find in deep heated mines. They're things that sometimes live off of radioactive materials. They like to be in heat and in pressure. And they can live off of pretty much purely chemical energy. And so they're part of an environment that might be common deep in Europa. Another type of organism is a halophile, and halophile means salt-loving. They really like high salt environments, so places like the salt flats, but also there are sinkholes at the bottom of the Earth's oceans, which we think are hypersaline, have lots and lots of salt. So those saline-loving bacteria are also things we might expect to find. And then my favorite are called psychophiles, and psychophiles are things that really like to be cold. They're perfectly happy in ice. They live in grain boundaries along crystals of ice. They live in the Arctic and the Antarctic. They live below glaciers, in glaciers, beside glaciers. And then they can have different ways of producing energy. And these are really interesting because they can actually reproduce and grow all the way down to 12 below C. So really cold loving bacteria. And so these things are totally happy living in environments that we might expect to be like those places on Europa, like inside the ice shell or deep in the ocean. And so we're excited about that too, because we can get a chance to study these organisms in the laboratory. And so what we're wondering is, we have an energetic system. We definitely have both terminals of the battery, but are we connecting those two? And so what our research that's focused mostly on the surface and in the shallow subsurface is trying to do is trying to understand, is this stuff on top from the energetic particles that's creating oxidants, creating things that are electron acceptors, interacting with the material down at the bottom that's creating electron donors? Are we ever mixing this material and allowing a flow of electrons the way that a flow of electrons powers batteries and powers life itself? But in order to understand how Europa really works, we're going to take a look at the whole system that includes that surface. And so here's a map of Europa's surface. So this is kind of, we've taken the whole surface and laid it out. And what jumps out at you right away probably are these crisscrossing fractures, right? And then you've got these dark spots down here, and we've got a little hole here, right? When you look at the moon, what do you see? You see craters, right? When you look at Mercury, what do you see? Lots of craters. There's a few craters on Earth, right? But not so many. There's a little bit more on Mars, but still not as many. But here on Europa, what do we see? We see almost none. What this tells us is that Europa is redoing its surface. Its surface is overturning rapidly, actually. So based on the number of craters on the surface of Europa, we think its surface is only about 40 million years old, which sounds really a lot to us, but in terms of 4.5 billion years of the solar system, it's an incredibly short time. The only places in the solar system that have a younger surface are the Earth and Io. So this is a really young surface, which tells us that Europa has been active, and it's been active recently, and it might even be active right now. So we look in really, really close, there's these other bizarre features. So there's these long arcs right here. These are called cycloids. They're a type of, we think, fracture. So if you think about how Earth's plate boundaries work, right, where they're kind of like fractures, and those plates move past each other. We think that the same kind of thing may be happening on Europa, except it's the ice that's doing that. So the tides are stretching Europa out and maybe cracking the surface, a little bit like cracking an egg. And so you kind of move the ice kind of past itself, and it might push up and create one of these ridges, either in an arc or in a line. And the whole surface of Europa is covered in these things, absolutely everywhere. And they have all different kinds of forms, places where there's multiple fractures that have seen the same environment, places that have just had a little bit different history. And because they lay on top of each other and then go past or over each other, we can actually use those to tell how old one piece of the surface is relative to another. So it's kind of like a big puzzle. We get to play around with the surface. And this is a really close view of an area right here, or an area like that right here. So an incredibly complicated surface. That whole surface is just made up of these little fractures. And so what we think is that they're fractures, but we're really not certain. We're still trying to understand Europa, even at this basic level. This is another feature. They're called bands. But back to that seafloor argument, right? You've heard about seafloor spreading, right? Where the plates are kind of pulling apart and material might be coming up from underneath. So as those plates are coming apart, if you imagine the same things happening here on Europa, then what you've got here is a band of material, and it looks like the ice has kind of been pulled apart, and a little bit of that material is kind of coming up from underneath. What we think is that that's probably just more ice from below, but that brittle part is still being stretched a little bit like the Earth. And the reason that we think that is if you look really close, if you look at this fracture and this fracture, you could actually line them up with their buddies on the other side. So it looks like these two fractures have been split by that surface being pulled out. And so we've got an interesting story about how Europa's rebuilding its surface over a relatively short period of time. And these are kind of the stars of the show from my perspective. These are called modeled terrain or chaos terrain. And it's exactly because we don't really, or didn't originally really know what they were like. These are a type of feature that are only found on Europa. Ganymede doesn't have them, Callisto doesn't have them, Enceladus doesn't have them. We haven't seen them anywhere else in the solar system. And so these features are like little dark sinkholes in some places. In some places they get big domes in the middle. In some places you have both. And so we've been trying to understand really what does this tell us about Europa. And what's fun about them is that they're not only small. This is an example of a close-up of a really small one, about 5 kilometers, but they can also be really, really big. So this is about 100 kilometers, so really, really huge features. So they're basically reworking that surface. So what does that tell us about Europa? And these are two more of those features, and as you can see, they all look a little bit different. They have some things in common, like the dark material, but they all look a little bit different, and they're all disrupting that surface. And we're not really quite sure why. So the original idea is that maybe these chaos terrains are basically telling us what the ice shell itself is like. Perhaps it says that the ice shell is thin, or perhaps it says that the ice shell is thick. And it really depends on what you interpret the surface as, what this means. And for a long time it was thought that, well, it must be better for biology if this ice shell is thin. And we'll talk about for the rest of the talk why that might not be the case. In fact, as long as this is overturning pretty rapidly, this thick shell case is just as good for biology as the thin shell case. And so this is basically the way the geologists are studying Europa, is we're trying to use images of the surface and gravity data and magnetic data to be able to tell us or indicate what's going on in the interior. What's the ice shell doing? What's the ocean doing down below that? So we're going to focus in on one particular type of feature. And these are these chaos terrains. And what I'm showing here is Connemara chaos, right? What does it look like to you? Do these look like anything? Like glass shards, right? Or like ice that's broken up or something? Right? It looks like something has been shattered. And so that was actually one of the observations that geologists made when they first got glimpses of the surface. Since we know it's all made of ice, what we've done is to classify these things in terms of what they look like. And so we call these things icebergs or ice blocks. We see this material in between that looks like kind of broken up ice. It doesn't really look like water, and we know it's frozen, so we call it matrix material. It's the stuff that's between the icebergs. But we notice that this matrix material is usually really dark red. If you remember those pictures from afar, that dark material is actually this matrix. This is just a black and white image, but this whole floor is really, really dark red. You also see evidence for fractures, for big, huge cliffs, and for these domes that are going to form in these features as well. And when you go to a different one that looks a little bit different, you still have the same things. You still have icebergs, you still have big cliffs, you still have these fractures, you still have matrix material, you have some domes starting to form down here, and you have this dark material. So they have a lot in common with each other, even if they look a little bit different. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take a cruise down in and go check out Connemara chaos. And so we're zooming into every resolution of picture that Galileo got. And so this is a global picture of Europa. And as we like to say for Connemara chaos, X marks the spot. Two big, huge ridges that are going through, kind of telling us there's something special going on here. And as we go in, it's going to get a little pixelated, and then we'll go to the next view of Connemara. And remember, I talked about that matrix material, that dark reddish material. Well, that's pretty much what it looks like. It's pretty dark compared to the rest of the material, whereas this stuff is pretty much pure water ice. So we've got evidence for salts, for magnesium, for sulfur, some really interesting potential nutrients in this material, but then also for these icebergs kind of floating around inside of that. And so it was kind of reminiscent of places that we'd seen, but also really different. And so using these different views of Connemara chaos, we're trying to understand really what's creating the feature that we see. So one of my favorite ones is right here. It looks like this tipped over feature, right? Like an iceberg that's tipped completely over right there. Big cliffs, we're going to zoom in here and see kind of a perspective view on that as well. And so the highest resolution that we saw, actually, for the most part on Europa, we wouldn't have been able to see this lecture hall. But in some places, we got in really, really close. And so this is basically what we think it looks like deep down on the surface. These big cliffs, huge icebergs floating around in kind of a mixed up ice material here on the bottom. So we know that chaos is unique to Europa, and we've made these observations of this broken up appearance, this matrix material. But what does that tell us? So originally, it told us, well, we've got two models for how these things might form. One of them was that you melted all the way through, and then you had liquid water coming up, and the icebergs are floating around. And the second one was that maybe you have instead like a little bit more like the Earth's mantle, right? In the Earth's mantle, hot rock is kind of flowing up, and you get hot rock coming up. And so in Europa, we think about that in terms of warm ice. So ice that's been warmed up by being close to the ocean kind of transfers up, comes up close to the surface, and does just a little bit of melting. But the problem was that it turned out these things just don't sit right. And literally, they don't sit right. The topography ends up being wrong. And so we're going to use that to look at it. So and the reason that I'm saying that topography ends up being wrong, when you put, let's say you take a glass of water and you put ice cubes in it. What do those ice cubes do? They float, right? So and what do? They sit up on top, right? So you see them kind of sitting up on top. So if these icebergs are really floating, this color code is basically telling you the height of the materials on Europa's surface. So when we look at this one, low is these kind of blues and greens, and high is the red. Well, the weird thing about Connemara chaos is that right now, at least, it looks like the icebergs are low, and the stuff that they're supposedly floating in are up high. So it's kind of like, huh, what's going on here? And so this didn't really sit right with me. Didn't look like it was sitting right with Europa either. And so we decided that we would look in our backyard for examples of what might actually be controlling these features here on Europa. And so we're going to go to Antarctica and to Iceland in order to try to crack this problem. And so what we've done is the group that I work with in Texas has a plane that they use to fly over ice-covered environments here on Earth. But we're actually using a system that's analogous, that's the same system that will end up flying on the next Europa mission if we're lucky. So this is the planned Europa mission, and a big radar antenna, just a big version of what Don and his group are doing in Antarctica and in Greenland. And so we go and we try to basically act like a spacecraft and try to figure some of this out. And so one of the first things that you notice when you're flying around above ice environments on Earth is that there are some things that remind you of Europa. And going back to that idea that maybe the ice was really, really thin, people thought, okay, well, look at these polygons, look at these blocks of sea ice. Well, maybe that's what Europa's like. But if you look at the front of calving glaciers in Greenland, what you actually see here is maybe the observations match up a little bit more. What do you seem to be missing here? You don't really see cliffs, right? You don't really have this huge, thick ice. And here in Greenland, at the front where the glacier's starting to go afloat, you see these huge, huge cliffs. What actually is happening here is that this is controlled by melt, but this place is controlled by fractures. So the ice comes off, gets little fractures inside of it, and water kind of works its way around and breaks up the ice. So what you end up with are huge, massive icebergs floating around that can, float down and sink the Titanic. And here you end up with stuff that melts every year. So it's a little bit different. So we like to think about it more in terms of these fractures than in terms of sea ice. Another environment that was really helpful for us was to think about subglacial volcanoes. So we know that there's melting going on probably at Europa because it's allowing material to float around. But what we didn't know is what happens when that melts. Well, what do we know about ice and water? If you take ice floats in water, why? It's less dense, right? So what happens when you melt an ice cube? It takes up less space, right? So the same thing happens on the Earth when a volcano becomes active. So if you imagine a volcano that was filled up with ice in the middle and it creates a lake, let's say without ice on top of it. What happens is as that water kind of fills up if it fills up the crater, when it reaches the edge of the crater, of the volcanic crater, it just runs out the sides. Well, it turns out that if you actually put that system under a sheet of ice, what happens is your ice melts and it contracts. So that volume that contracts, it actually pulls the surface of the ice down. It kind of makes this huge depression. That's what you're seeing right here. There's a volcano under here that's active, and it's pulled down the surface of the ice. And what's cool about that is that it actually tells the water where to go. And instead of running out the sides, it tells it to go in, because there's more pressure from the ice over here and less of it over here. So what it creates is a pocket of water. So you get these kind of weird dome-shaped pockets of water that if there wasn't ice on top, you wouldn't expect to be there. So this was an observation that we thought was pretty cool. And we can observe things like that on the Earth too. So this is that same thing when we're just looking at the surface. This is a picture, a radargram that our group took of Lake Vostok. You've probably heard of Lake Vostok. It's not exactly the same situation because there's not a volcano under here, but what you can see is that we can kind of detect the lake, and it's actually turning over right here. It's kind of being pushed by the ice. And so it's being controlled by the ice over the top. So we can actually study that here on Earth. Another place that we looked at to try to crack this problem literally was to look at ice shelves. And so this is an Antarctic ice shelf, and what's happening here, you can see these little dark lines. is there's just a little bit of meltwater ponding up on the surface. And it's actually getting down inside of fractures. And what will end up happening is that little bit of water does a whole lot of damage. And so it shatters this whole ice shelf. What happens here is that fractures up on top and fractures from down below just do a little bit of work on a little bit of space that ends up making a huge difference. So it's cracking out all of this ice, and it's also creating big, giant icebergs. They're absolutely huge. These things are the size of Rhode Island, and just giant icebergs. And so those are very Europa-scale processes. And it's the way that you break really strong ice using just a little bit of water. So what we did is to take these examples and think about it, right? So the other thing is that we can actually observe these on Earth. This is another radargram, so that same plane flying over pretending to be a spacecraft. And what you're seeing here, see these dark kind of arcs? That's actually the radar telling you that there's a water-filled fracture. So this fracture right here is there's water all the way up inside the iceberg. So it's telling you that the bottom fractures, where the ocean is coming up inside of the iceberg, inside of the ice shelf, is actually making a huge difference. So we can actually study things like that just using the radar right here, and maybe predict when these things might happen on Earth. But another fun thing about it is that then it produces this environment that reminds us of Europa again. The difference is that these blocks are rectangular, and the reason they're rectangular is actually because the fractures are all lines. Right? As the glacier's flowing off the continent, it kind of bobs up and down in the ocean, and it basically all forms linear fractures. On Europa, because of the tides, you're going like this. So you've got fractures all over the place, but you're still breaking along fractures in the same way. So what we think is that same process that was causing Antarctic's ice shelves to disintegrate might be the same process that's causing Europa's ice shelf to disintegrate. Just a little bit of water moving things around. And so that was basically the study that we did. And so I'm going to show you a video of what we think is happening. We're going to take those two environments from the Earth, put them together, and see if we get Europa. So we're zooming into Europa, and we're imagining that this is warm material that's actually being heated from below, starts to move upwards, starts to push on and melt this ice right here. You create a lake, you start creating some icebergs, and then when it refreezes, it actually ends up pushing the surface back up. If you remember, I said the topography was kind of weird at these things, that there were places where the ice was higher than the icebergs. Have you ever put a soda can in the freezer? Done that before? Your mom was probably mad at you when you did that, because they explode, right? And what's happening there is that the material is expanding. So what we think is that as this thing is refreezing, material is refreezing and taking up more space. So the idea is that you have this warm material come up, creates a melt pocket, ends up breaking up your icebergs, and then you enter the Coke can phase over here, where the whole thing refreezes, and the material that was just a little bit porous has kind of soaked up material like a sponge. It's soaked up a little more water than it had before. And when that expands out, it gives us a reason why the material in between the icebergs might now be higher. It's just got a little bit more water than the icebergs do. And so it seemed to fit our picture. What was even more exciting about that is it told us where we might go looking for water, liquid water, that's near the surface of Europa even right now. So what I'm showing here again is dark colors are low, and this red color is high. And as I mentioned, the ice shell, when you start to melt the water, it kind of collapses, right? You collapse the surface down. And if you look right here, you can see there's kind of a slope here. This is all inward facing. So this whole ring is actually sunken down. So the ice is flat like this, and the whole thing's gone down like this, which tells us that, in fact, this pocket of water might still be liquid. Another thing that tells us that is that here, the floor, that matrix material, that kind of salt, brine-rich material, is still low. The icebergs are still sitting up on top, which tells us that the icebergs are still floating. It hasn't refrozen yet. It's refrozen down here, but it's still liquid here. We mentioned that fractures are important, right? A little bit of water getting up in there. You can actually see that happening right here. So right here at letter A, you can see this big fracture that's opening. You can see some fractures that are opening here. And so we're actually cracking up the ice by collapsing the surface. So what we think is that this is telling us there's a huge amount of water here. And when you run the numbers, it tells you that based on how much these icebergs are floating, right? Ice is 10% less dense than water. If you make an estimation, then this is about 3 kilometers down is where all the water is. And if you run the numbers of how much deflection you've gotten, it turns out to be at least as much water as all of the Great Lakes combined. There's a huge lake potentially right here underneath the surface of Europa. And it's right there right now. So what it means is that here at Thermophiles, this huge feature, we actually have this giant lake of water that's sitting there underneath the surface. And then here at Connemara Chaos, maybe you had one a few 100,000 years ago, maybe even longer, but now it's refrozen. So if you're thinking about where to go explore, if you go back to Europa, man, I'd sure like to go right here where there's some water we could get a sample of. It's pretty fun, too, because if you imagine that ice is a good place to live, well, ice that's interacting with water is even better. So maybe these lakes could have something to do with supporting life if it ever arose on Europa. But what's even more exciting is that this material, we saw how fast that happened in Antarctica, right? It's a pretty violent process. Now, it's probably a little bit slower at Europa, but that initial collapse is probably really quick. And what that does is it gives a chance for that material, those oxidants, those electron receptors, to actually get mixed down into this lake. And then these plumes, when they cool down, can actually sink and take that material with them. So what we think is that we're churning this up. Don likes to call it like a washing machine. And these icebergs are kind of churning the surface up, bringing that material down to the lake that might then bring it down further into the ocean. And this is kind of a video of that process happening. We're going to return back to that same calving front that I showed the picture with the huge ice cliff, right, with the plane going over the top. This is the same place. And what you're looking at is it's just going to start going. All of a sudden, the ice starts flowing. You're getting stuff turning over. Remember that tipped iceberg I showed you? And then we get these huge ones that are calving. So this is about a kilometer thick ice. Like there's like a little tent somewhere in here. So these are huge, absolutely huge. So miles thick ice are flipping over and bringing material from the surface down into the water, even here in Greenland. And so what we think is that this might actually be happening at Europa, which is why we're so excited about it, because it gives us kind of the potential that we're actually connecting those cells on the battery. Back to this system, we've got oxidants up here and reductants down here, and maybe we're actually connecting the terminal by bringing material up, heating it up, creating these lakes, refreezing it, and then returning it down to the ocean. And so if this surface is getting mixed up, then that material actually is making it down to the ocean, or it might get a chance to be part of supporting life. So what's next for Europa? Well, our group has been really hard at work trying to plan the next spacecraft to go. We mentioned that we're playing around with radars and doing a lot of work on the Earth, both for the Earth itself and for Europa. And we'd love to send a spacecraft. It's actually being planned, so call your congressman. But what's really exciting, too, is that since we live here on Earth, and as I've shown, there are so many environments that are so much like Europa, we can actually go and study them. So I'm going to show you kind of a cool video. We just got a grant funded to go take a submarine very much like this. This is the previous version, and go underneath one of those ice shelves and go looking at how life might exist underneath an ice shelf, just like places on Europa. Oops. Let's see if it can go. We're gonna see it drop us on. So this is a robot called Endurance. So it actually did a lake survey in Lake Bonny in Antarctica, which is a frozen lake. And so this is a little submarine this is actually in water. It's sped up. So this is the same kind of little guy that we're going to take and put underneath the ice shelf, kind of swim around and look up and look down and see how life works underneath ice. And here's a fun one. This is actually the same little guy. This is Endurance, figuring out where he's going. So Endurance is actually an automated robot, so he can actually find his way home. And so what he's doing is he's kind of going along the ice, sees the hole, swims himself all the way up inside the hole, and you'll start to see the people. And there's the people right there. So that's Endurance actually coming up from underneath the ice in Antarctica. So what we're hoping to do in the next couple of years is take this guy and kind of a little cousin of his and do some exploring and look at how the environment in Antarctica might be the same biologically as environments on Europa. So we're really excited about that. So that's what's next, at least for us, in terms of trying to understand Europa. And so back to Galileo for a moment. I mentioned that Galileo kind of turned us upside down in terms of where we were in the solar system. And I kind of think of it as being maybe poetic justice if we were to go and find life on Europa, because it'd be just another example of the Jovian system and Galileo overturning where we see ourselves. So that's it. So let's go.
Brittany, we'll be happy to take questions. Just raise your hand and...
Sure.
Just repeat their questions when you hear them.
Sure.
Just go ahead.
We'll start.
Go ahead and pick.
Start down here, and then we'll go over there. Go ahead.
Please be really quiet so we can hear the questions. Thank you very much. Gesundheit.
Yep. So the question was, do we have any idea what the chemistry in these dark areas is? Yeah. So Galileo, I showed mostly data from the spectrometer. I mean, from the imaging cameras, but it also had a spectrometer. And so that spectrometer tells us that those materials are made up of some water ice, but they're made up of sulfur, sodium, and magnesium salts in some kind of mixture. So it's hard to interpret spectral data, but it basically tells you what the things are in there besides water ice. And so the white areas are very pure water ice, and the other material has quite a lot of those impurities in there. There was a question over there. Yeah. Do the moons have moons? So the question was, do the moons have moons? I don't know of any that do. There's a lot of asteroids that do, though. There's some asteroids that actually have little tiny moons as well. And if you think about it, if you look at Pluto, right? Pluto is, depending on who you ask, the 9th planet in the solar system. I still think it's a planet. But if you look at Pluto, one of the reasons that we talk about maybe is Pluto a planet or not is because it has a moon that's almost as big as it is. So Pluto's kind of like a planet and a moon, and so is Charon. So they're kind of like planets and moons the same way. Sure, we'll go here. Yeah, that's a really big question. So the question was, when we go to explore Europa, do we have to worry about contamination? And that's a really big question. So it turns out that they were so worried about contaminating Europa that when Galileo, the spacecraft, started to lose control, when they started to have the electronics dying from all the radiation, they actually flung it into Jupiter to make sure that it didn't impact on Europa. And so when all of these missions are planned, even orbital missions, we're trying to think about ways that we can prevent us from taking things that would like to be at Europa there. So it's a huge question. Some of the things that they do are to put the spacecraft in acid baths. They'll put them in heaters, heat them up. And another new idea is that actually if you run it directly into the planet, the energy from that explosion might actually end up blowing up everything anyway. So that's kind of some of the things that we thought about. In terms of taking a lander there and taking samples, it's a really big question. So if we ever land, probably what will be done is you'll bring a blank so that you know that you're testing what's in your system and testing what's on Europa and knowing what the difference is. So yeah, it's a huge consideration. Okay, right there, red shirt. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a couple different ways. Oh, sorry. The question was, how do we know that it has a rocky mantle or an iron core or a magnetic field? So as far as the structure of the planet itself, it's actually from its gravity signature. It turns out when you've got a spacecraft orbiting the planet, you can tell because the planet will pull on the spacecraft according to how much gravity the planet has. And it'll work differently for different types of internal structures. What happens is the gravity signature from a sphere that has multiple layers has a different behavior than a sphere that's uniform. And you can tell how density stratified the material is by the interaction with the gravity field. So just by watching the spacecraft get tugged on by the planet, we can tell what the gravity signature is. As far as the magnetic field is, we basically just take a big magnet with us. We take a magnetometer that basically reads magnetic fields, and we stick it out on a boom, and then it reads magnetic fields. So you get a sense of whether the planet has a magnetic field or not from that. So more questions? Let's go here. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So no problem. So the first question was, could we figure out how deep the ice shell is based on the cracks, based on how old they are? And you're right to make the observation that there's dark cracks and light cracks. And it's true, actually. Young terrain on Europa tends to be darker, and old terrain tends to be lighter. So we know that it actually is aging over time. As far as does that tell us about how deep the ice shell is, that depends on the mechanism. However, what you can do is you can use how those big fat ridges, how they cause the area around them to deform. It turns out that they put a lot of weight on it. So it's like if you push down on something, then you can tell the weight of the material that's pushing down, and you can tell how flexible the other material is. So we can use those types of observations. But all it's telling you really is how thick the top layer is. So we think that Europa is kind of like two layers, where you've got a brittle layer, and that's the part that can kind of bend with all the stuff laid up on top of it, and then a warmer ductile layer like the Earth's mantle down below. And so you've got a layer of brittle ice like our own crust, and a layer of warmer kind of convecting material like the Earth's mantle. And so one of the things that the fractures, or that the geology does tell us, is probably that it's a thicker ice shell. And that's because of how impact features end up looking. And then also about how chaos looks. So the reason things aren't floating right is because the ice is so thick that those icebergs aren't floating in the ocean. They're floating in a trapped layer. And so that floating looks different. The second question was, do we have any evidence for life being carbon-based or being based on something else? That's a really interesting question. One of the questions that people like to pose is, well, why couldn't there be life on Titan that was based on ethane instead of water? And it's not that really I have any particularly good examples for why not. But in terms of as we go looking for life, we'd like to have a slam dunk indication. And so if you imagine a system of life that uses a different type of chemistry, it's not that it might not be possible, it's that would we recognize it? So the reason that I'm focused on Europa, the reason I'm interested in Europa, and the reason many people are interested in Europa and Mars is because the chemistry is the same. And so we might have a chance of recognizing organized life. Whereas in a complex chemical environment like Titan, for instance, you might not recognize it because it might work differently. And so it's not that it really couldn't. That's a better question for a real biologist. But in terms of my perspective on it, the reason we go looking at places like this is because we might know it when we see it. So I hope that helps. Well, it basically has similar chemistry, we think, to to the Earth, and it's because of how we know the solar system forms. The basic starting materials for Europa and for the Earth are basically the same, and so the chemistry is likely to be very similar. Same thing with Titan, actually. It's just that Titan has a different surface. So, yeah, over there in the blue shirt. There you go. I have been studying Europa for, oh my gosh, it's about to become 10 years. So, yeah, which is pretty long. I turned 30 next week, so I've been studying it since I was 20, so that's a third of my life. That's pretty much a long time. So, oh, thanks. Let's go over here. Yeah, no, actually, I'm not really sure that that's been done. What we know is that it creates a really radiation-intense environment. Oh, sorry, the question was, do we know, has any experiment been done about the effect of a high magnetic field on life? There's a lot of work that gets done on what radiation and magnetic fields do to already existing life, and it breaks down cell walls, breaks down their ability to repair themselves, and ends up killing things. So radiation is really bad. In terms of magnetic environments, I guess the jury's kind of out. I'm not aware of any highly magnetic environments that are exclusive of life, but I'm not certain how much that has been looked at. So the nice thing is that actually in Europa's ocean, the magnetic field is high, but it's not that high. So it's mostly the radiation that seems to be the bad thing. And once you get a few millimeters below the surface, it's not a problem at all. Where? Oh, yeah, go ahead. Striped shirt. The question was, are there black holes near Europa? As far as I know, there are not. We would know about them because our solar system would lose. Black holes are kind of weird because they pull everything in around them. And so we orbit the sun because it's the most massive thing in our neighborhood. And the sun is orbiting other systems. So our solar system is orbiting a huge black hole at the center of our galaxy, but it's pretty far away. So if it was right at Europa, we probably wouldn't be here. So no worries. But it's, you know, one of the questions early on was maybe did the sun have a companion? So there's lots of really interesting things that happen out there in space. So.
Say, Brittany, here's a question from someone watching the webcast from Port Aransas. It's from Matt, Sam, and Jeff. Most of the life in Earth's oceans depends upon dissolved oxygen for respiration. Is there dissolved oxygen in the Europa water? If not, how would potential life on Europa respire?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. So you've got the question. So the question about dissolved oxygen is one that we talk about a lot. So there's no real production of oxygen in terms of an atmosphere, but one of the oxidized materials that is produced on the surface of Europa, because you have H2O, you have water, is you produce a lot of hydrogen peroxide, so you get H2O2. So you actually do end up with a lot of material that could be oxygen rich. Whether that becomes dissolved oxygen in the ocean is a question that we don't really have an answer to. But there are other materials that can act as oxidants, that can play the same role that oxygen plays. Oxygen plays an important role here, largely because of photosynthesis, but it may be a little bit different on Europa, but there still are sources in terms of hydrogen peroxide and other things that if it makes it down might be the same. More questions down here. So the question was, is it true that it's possible life originated from lightning interactions with this idea of the warm, wet pond? So the Miller-Yuri experiments were some of the original experiments on the origins of life, and what they did is to kind of put a bunch of organic molecules together, and in order to try to make the energy jump that's required to go from just a bunch of inert chemicals to life or to organic compounds or to things that are exchanging electrons, what they did was to zap it with electricity, which was a really great experiment. And what it did is it created a lot of prebiotic materials. The difference is that that's one way to create it really rapidly in one environment. The black smokers that I showed you earlier are another way to get across that energy barrier. And so there's a number of ways to get across those energy barriers. If you're trying to get across the energy barrier of a large amount of material in a very, very rapid fashion, that's one way you can do it. One of the observations, though, is that while it does produce, while that interaction did produce organic kind of prebiotic type molecules, it didn't produce handedness. It didn't care whether it was right-handed or left-handed chemistry. So one of the things that's interesting about some of these systems that grow on the seafloor and that involve iron chemistry is that the structures might actually set up that way because of vacancies in the chemistry, basically how those materials are put together. And so that's an idea that's kind of new. So the forefront of kind of, or the precursor prebiotic chemistry now is looking at metal reactions in aqueous systems that actually set up the same kind of energy barrier. And rather than jumping directly to a mixture of stuff, you can actually direct it just by the seeming accident of iron chemistry. So that's an example. So the jury's out, but it looks like we don't actually potentially need the warm, wet pond idea. As far as lightning on Europa, it doesn't have an atmosphere. And so you need electric discharge in order to create that. So one of the exciting things is if these ideas about organic life starting at seafloor vents is that chemistry just happens from the rock and the water interacting. And it's really exciting to me because it means that any environment that has that, there's not a lot of, there isn't special pleading for what kind of an environment you need. So a place like Europa might be really habitable in that sense. So that was a really good question. Let's go back here. Pink shirt, please. The question is, why is it important if we know life's anywhere else? To some people, I don't think it probably is all that important. Or people are really happy, hanging out, doing their thing. To me, I just think it's really exciting. The reason I'm interested in it is because if there's one other example in our solar system, to me it seems like there's probably hundreds of examples in our own galaxy, maybe thousands. And so it's really a question for me of kind of where we've come from and where we're going. And so to me, I like thinking about looking out. And so it's important to me. It might be important to you. It's not necessarily important to everyone, but at least it's interesting. So good question. Another little pink shirt. What's the oldest planet? Well, it depends on how you count your age. If you count age on your face, then the oldest planet is probably Mercury. Actually no, that might be Jupiter. Jupiter might be the oldest, but Jupiter's kind of erasing its face all the time. So in terms of rocks, it turns out that everything in the solar system is about the same age, for the most part. All the planets basically formed around the same time. Some of them may have formed a little bit later. Europa's probably a little bit younger than we are in terms of its actual birth date, but most of the stuff in the solar system is about the same age. So that's a really good question. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's a really good question. The question was, could life have gotten to Europa from somewhere else? So that's a question that's called Panspermia. It's an idea that people have presented for the idea that life might get exchanged between the Earth and Mars. The reason it's suggested for Earth and Mars is because they're close. There's easy ways for a rock from Earth to get to Mars and vice versa. It's still pretty hard to do. You have to get really lucky. So if you think about Earth and Mars are only about half an astronomical unit, right? Half our distance to the sun away from each other. Europa is about 5. So it's a lot further out. So if you're thinking about a rock trying to get from Earth to Europa, for instance, it's also, Europa is a little tiny target in a huge solar system. So as you eject rocks coming out of an impact event, it's really it's a way cosmic hole-in-one to get there. And the other thing is that the gravity is actually telling most of the material to go in. So it's hard to get that kind of material. And stuff in the outer solar system is much colder, so it's probably not coming in from the outer solar system. What might be coming in are precursor materials. So one of the cool ideas for the Earth and for why it might have life is, did water and organic material come from the outer solar system in the form of comets and impact the early Earth? And that question is something that I'm really interested in and worked on when I was an undergrad. And so that's the types of things that might be happening. It's a really small chance that Panspermia would be important for Europa, which is another reason why we think it's really a good place to go looking. It's not a really high chance that there could be Panspermia between Mars and Europa, or Mars and Earth. There's almost no chance of it being at Europa. So if you find it at Europa, you can be fairly certain that it actually started there.
Do we have a final question for Britney?
There's someone in the back. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, really good. A good way to think about that is who won the Super Bowl last year? But who won the Super Bowl in 1984? Right? You might know. But so if you think about it, so one of the questions is that we're prisoners of the moment in certain aspects. Is that we're at Enceladus right now. It's really exciting. But if we compare the two bodies in terms of energy, Enceladus is almost on a circular orbit, and it's really tiny. So Europa has a radius of 1,500 kilometers, and Enceladus has a radius of 250. Really, really small. And it's in terms of tidal energy, it's putting out more energy now than it ever gets from tides. So what it seems to be indicating is that Enceladus may be periodically active. Another reason that we think that might be true is if you look at the Saturn system, right, those rings have beautiful organized structures, except for the E-ring, right? The E-ring is kind of new and it's diffuse and it hasn't really been organized. So it's another potential indication that that material isn't always there. It looks like Enceladus might be periodically goes in and out of activity. And it almost certainly doesn't have enough geothermal heat to be doing that. The other thing that's interesting in terms of Enceladus is that the geophysical observations don't suggest there's an ocean at all. They suggest there's a pocket of water at the South Pole. And so in terms of this refreshing biosphere argument, whether cycles are important for setting up chemical disequilibria that contributes to the rise of life, you might not have that on Enceladus, or at least not all the time. So that would be my answer to that one. Yeah.